I found out my sister was getting married through a Facebook post. No call, no text, just a photo. Jordan in white, Camilla smiling, captioned with love. At first I thought it was a joke, but it wasn't. I hadn't been invited, I wasn't forgotten, I was excluded. I didn't scream, I didn't cry. I sat there remembering all I had done for her. Birthday parties, late night calls, covering for her. And now, silence. I spiraled. What had I done? Was I too emotional, too honest, too me? That's the role I've always played. The difficult one, the one who asks why instead of smiling through it. This wasn't just exclusion, it was erasure. I checked again. Nothing. The post was real. They had planned it for months. I wasn't even part of the conversation. I held my phone and felt like a ghost. It wasn't the wedding. It was the care taken to keep me in the dark. The shock was quiet but deep. I made tea, hands shaking. The hurt felt old and new at once. I always feared this day. Not the wedding, but the quiet devastation of being intentionally left out. I thought about calling Jordan. I imagined her pretending surprise, saying it was too complicated or, "We thought you'd be stressed." It's what people say when they've already justified the hurt. I didn't call. I wrote, not for revenge, just to understand. I wrote about conditional love, how silence was rewarded, and how I was excluded not for being harmful, but for being real. I couldn't sleep. Memories of prom dresses and breakups replayed. I wasn't perfect, but I was loyal. In my family, that loyalty was one-sided. I'd been labeled too much for asking fair questions. Watching that post, something broke, but not in defeat. It was the start of honesty. A few days later, I called my dad. I hoped for an apology. What I got was gaslighting. He answered casually, like we hadn't been distant. I asked if he knew. He paused. Then he said, "It's not your kind of thing." He framed exclusion as protection. His tone was soft, but his words cut deep. He said, "We wanted a peaceful day." As if my presence disrupted peace. It sounded reasonable almost, but it wasn't. It was control dressed as care. I hung up, doubting myself, but I replayed the call. He hadn't been confused. He'd been in control. This wasn't an accident. It was a pattern. Subtle cruelty masked as love. The realization didn't free me, but it changed me. That night, I booked a flight to Santorini. No explanation, no dramatic exit. I wasn't running, I was choosing myself. I packed light, just what I needed. I didn't tell anyone. Not to hide, just to protect my peace. On the plane, I felt calm. For once, I wasn't editing myself for someone else. I wasn't overthinking. I just existed. There was no grand closure, just a quiet return to myself. I used to think I had to earn love. Now I just wanted air that didn't ask me to shrink. Santorini was light, open, free. I didn't plan. I didn't perform. I just lived. And in that space, something shifted. I wasn't broken. I was hurt. And that was okay. I started journaling, not to solve, but to hear myself again. I shared a few moments online, peaceful ones, and I felt the shift. A cousin watched my stories. The silence was breaking. Not loudly, but it was. I didn't post to provoke. I wasn't bitter. I was just being. And that honesty spoke louder than any confrontation. My absence wasn't empty. It was full of clarity. Noah messaged me, just thinking of you. No demands, no guilt, just presence. It meant more than any apology ever could. At the wedding, they said I had other plans. That was true. I chose peace. The irony was my calm unsettled them more than any outburst. I kept posting, smiles, sunsets, street music, not messages, just moments, and they felt it. The story they told themselves about me was cracking. There's power in letting go. It doesn't shout, but it builds. Each time I didn't explain, each time I didn't chase, it grew. On the wedding day, I watched the sunrise. I didn't think about them. I felt the breeze. I was not part of their story that day, and that was powerful. I posted a photo, just feet over the cliff and sea, no caption, just presence. That image unsettled the narrative. I wasn't missing out. I was choosing. A cousin later messaged, "You seem happy." I was, not wildly, but truly. I walked through alleys, drank wine, laughed with strangers, and I wasn't performing. I was just alive. The silence was my statement. The joy was my truth. I'd always been told I was too much, too honest, but maybe I was just too real for a family that preferred illusions. I wasn't left out because I was broken. I was excluded because I wouldn't lie. Santorini didn't fix me, but it freed me. It gave me space. I wasn't waiting for calls or apologies. I had stopped orbiting around people who couldn't see me. The day of the wedding, no one called. I didn't ache. I felt clear. I wasn't their version of family. I was my own. I wasn't waiting anymore. I was living. And that was enough. Later, I saw the wedding photos. Beautiful. Curated. A family smiling. I didn't flinch. I didn't ache to be there. I saw the space I'd have filled and felt nothing. No need to belong to something that never truly held me. I cried. Not for loss, but for release. The hope was gone. The need to prove, gone. In its place, truth. I wasn't healing by going back. I was healing by moving forward. I stopped rehearsing apologies. I stopped justifying my pain. I let go. And in that stillness, I found peace. Real peace. I survived being erased, without disappearing. That truth lived in me now. Quiet, steady, strong. After Santorini, something in me started to rearrange. I could feel it even in the way I moved through the world, slower, softer, but steadier. I no longer woke up wondering how others would interpret my existence. I just existed, and that felt radical. Back home, I didn't rush into explanations. I didn't announce anything or declare a new chapter on social media. I just lived, quietly, honestly. And the more I did, the less weight I carried. I started to pay attention to small things, how my shoulders no longer tensed when my phone lit up, how I no longer rehearsed messages before sending them. I wasn't looking for drama or resolution. I was looking for quiet, and I had found it. I reconnected with parts of myself that had gone quiet. I started painting again. Nothing fancy, just colors on canvas that didn't need to make sense to anyone but me. I filled my walls with things that made me feel grounded. Books I had been meaning to read, photos of places that reminded me of who I was when I wasn't performing. My apartment became a reflection of freedom, not survival. I found myself having unexpected conversations, with strangers mostly. At a bookstore, a woman complimented my scarf, and we ended up talking for an hour about grief and hope. It reminded me that connection doesn't have to be long to be deep. It just has to be real. I stopped chasing closure and started accepting reality. Not the sanitized version I used to feed myself, but the truth in all its discomfort. They didn't see me. They may never see me. And somehow that stopped feeling like a wound and started feeling like a boundary. One evening, I got a message from my uncle. He said he'd heard I'd gone away and hoped I was doing okay. I stared at that message for a long time before replying. I didn't want to be cold, but I also didn't want to pretend. So I just said, "Thanks for checking in. I needed space." He replied with a thumbs up. Nothing more. But that was enough. Not every moment needs to become a conversation. Some just need to be acknowledged. I began writing again. Not just in my journal, but in ways I could share. I wrote about boundaries, about choosing peace over performance. I didn't name names, I didn't air dirty laundry, but I was honest. Vulnerably, carefully honest. And what surprised me wasn't how many people read it. It was how many people saw themselves in it. Strangers wrote to me. Friends I hadn't spoken to in years reached out. They didn't ask for details. They just said thank you. And in those small responses, I started to feel something I hadn't in years: belonging. Not in a family structure, not in the roles I'd been assigned, but in truth, in community. I was learning that family isn't always blood. Sometimes it's people who hold your story without trying to edit it, people who sit beside your pain, without making it about them. I still thought about Jordan sometimes, about the gap between who we used to be and who we are now. But I didn't feel anger anymore, just distance. A quiet acceptance that some bridges don't burn in flames. They just stopped being walked on. I didn't need to cross that one again. Instead, I built something new. I said yes to things that felt like growth. I said no to things that drained me. I allowed myself to want more. Not more stuff, but more space, more ease, more days where I didn't have to armor up just to be myself. I went back to therapy. Not because I was falling apart, but because I wanted support while putting myself back together. We talked about boundaries, about guilt, about how sometimes the hardest part of healing is accepting that the people who hurt you won't always acknowledge it, and how that doesn't make your healing less valid. I learned how to hold both truths. I love my family, and they hurt me. I wish things had been different, and I'm no longer trying to make them be. I can grieve what I lost while building something better. And slowly, the weight lifted. I no longer felt the urge to scroll through their lives. I no longer measured my happiness against their silence. I had stopped auditioning. I had stopped waiting for the applause. I was simply here. Still. Real. Enough. There was a Saturday morning where I woke up before my alarm and didn't feel the usual heaviness. The kind that used to sit in my chest the moment consciousness returned. For the first time in what felt like forever, I just got up. No dread. No narrative running in the background about what I hadn't done, who I hadn't heard from, or what I needed to fix. I made coffee, sat by the window, and watched the light stretch across my kitchen floor. It sounds small, but it felt monumental. A quiet reminder that peace doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it's just the absence of ache. I started planning a short trip. Nothing big, just a weekend somewhere new. I used to feel guilty about traveling alone, like it was something I had to justify. Now it felt like a gift, a way to celebrate the fact that I was learning to enjoy my own company. I didn't post about it. I didn't text anyone my itinerary. It was mine, just mine. In therapy, I talked about that moment, about the coffee, the sunlight, the ease. My therapist smiled and said, "That's integration." I asked what she meant. She said, "Healing isn't always a breakthrough. It's when the pain stops leading the way. When you start building your life around your values instead of your wounds." I let that settle, because that was it. I had stopped trying to get back to who I used to be. I had started becoming who I was meant to be all along. Every now and then, I'd see signs of my family, posts online, updates from mutual connections, and instead of feeling pulled back in, I felt more grounded in my decision to stay out. It wasn't resentment, it was recognition. I could love them and still know that loving them didn't mean giving them unrestricted access to me. One evening, I got an invite to a family gathering. Extended family, nothing major. The old me would have agonized over it. What to wear, what to say, whether I'd be able to smile through the weight of everything unspoken. But this time, I just declined. Politely. No drama, no follow-up explanation. I knew what that event would ask of me, and I wasn't willing to shrink again. That was growth, not in the shouting, boundary-setting kind of way, but in the gentle, self-trusting way. I spent that evening writing, not about them, about me, about the woman I was becoming. I wrote about how grief had changed shape, how loneliness had softened into solitude, how silence had become something sacred instead of something forced. I wrote about how good it felt to trust myself again, to no longer second-guess the validity of my own experience, to stand in my truth without needing anyone else to validate it. And the more I wrote, the more I realized I wasn't just healing. I was living. I wasn't waiting for the pain to pass. I was creating moments that made the pain irrelevant, not because it didn't exist, but because it no longer ruled me. I had learned how to carry it without letting it steer. A few weeks later, I bumped into someone who used to know me back when I was still in the thick of it. Someone who had seen me trying to hold everything together with shaking hands and a practiced smile. They looked at me for a moment, tilted their head, and said, "You seem different." I didn't rush to explain. I just smiled and said, "I am." That was all. And it felt enough. That moment stayed with me, not because of what they said, but because of what I didn't feel. I didn't feel the need to prove anything. I didn't feel the urge to share my side of the story. I didn't even feel the pressure to be understood. I had finally reached a place where I could be witnessed, without performing. That's what freedom felt like. There were still hard days. I don't want to paint a picture where everything is wrapped up in a neat bow. Some mornings, the sadness still crept in. Some nights, I still dreamt about conversations that never happened. But even in those moments, I no longer felt lost in it. I didn't spiral. I didn't make myself wrong for still feeling. I just let it be. And that, I realized, was healing too. Not fixing, not rushing, just allowing. I continued writing, continued creating a life that made sense to me. My circle stayed small, but it felt solid. The people in it didn't flinch at my honesty. They didn't ask me to edit my story so it was easier to hear. They held space. They listened. They showed up. And slowly, that became my new definition of family. One night, I sat on my balcony, journal open, the sky full of stars, and I wrote a sentence that had been forming in me for months. I survived being erased without having to disappear. That line held everything. The grief, the growth, the reclamation. I didn't need their permission to exist. I didn't need their applause to know I was worthy. I had written myself back into the story, and this time, I was the one holding the pen. When the messages from old relatives came, small check-ins, curious pokes, I responded with kindness, but I didn't offer access. I didn't open the door, not out of anger, but out of love. For myself. Because I knew now what it cost me to keep inviting people who didn't really see me. I wasn't building walls, I was planting boundaries, and watching them grow into peace. Somewhere along the way, I stopped waiting for the perfect moment to declare closure. I just kept choosing it, in how I spent my time, in who I allowed in what I let go of. And the more I did, the more I saw that healing wasn't a destination, it was a practice. A way of living that made space for all the parts of me I used to hide. And maybe, just maybe, that's what this was all about. Not being invited to a wedding. Not the silence. Not even the pain. But the invitation it gave me to return to myself. To finally stop begging for a seat at their table and start building one of my own. One where honesty is welcomed. One where I don't have to trade pieces of myself to stay in the room. That's the table I sit at now, every day. And when I look around, even on the quietest days, I feel it. Not loneliness, not absence, but presence, peace, wholeness. Not because everything is perfect, but because I no longer need it to be. And that, more than anything, is the life I was always meant to live.